Hey, this is Joel Duff, and let's continue to talk about the origin of thorns. Thorns, prickles, spines, needles, they all provide effective means of protection for plants against many herbivores such as ourselves, which would otherwise find them to be a great source of nourishment. A common perception among many Christians and otherwise is that the Genesis account of creation, read in a particular literalistic sense, leads one to believe that God created plants with no form of natural protection against herbivores. Because, after all, God pronounced that in Genesis 1:29, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth and every tree that has fruit in it. They will be yours for food, and to all the beasts of the earth and to all the birds in the sky and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. But does giving plants for food require that every single portion of every plant was edible, or that it would require no labor whatsoever to gain that food source? We might also ask, did plants produce any toxic chemicals in their leaves or bark to make themselves unpalatable before Adam's sin? Would a ripe apple even have been different than an unripe one in the Garden of Eden, since today unripe apples produce chemicals that discourage us from eating them until they ripen? Why would Eve have perceived one fruit good to eat if every single portion of every plant were given to eat and couldn't have had a bad taste? This is the perception that some have of the Garden of Eden, of this perfect world, and the Garden of Eden not just being a particular place, but being the ecological condition of the entire earth upon the completion of creation. Now, in the previous video, we saw that young earth creationists are convinced that thorn bushes and thistle plants must have had their origins after Adam's sin. That video is called Adam, Eden, and the Corruption of Nature, a Thorny Young Earth Assumption. We asked if this made any sense in the light of ecology of the original creation and the context of the rest of scriptures. Now, what I want to do today is I'd like to explore the origin of thorns a little bit further, but this time I want to look at a particular group of plants that are often associated with their extreme thorns, the acacias. I want to share a brief history of acacias with you, and then I'm going to pose this question. What did acacia trees look like in the Prelapsarian world? Fancy way of saying the world before Adam, or before the fall of Adam, at least within the traditional Christian perspective. We've got that coming up next. Let's start by talking about acacias. Acacias are a species of tree, or are a number of species of tree and shrubs that traditionally have been categorized in the genus Acacia, although that genus has recently divided into multiple genera. There's over 1,300 recognized species and innumerable varieties of things that are labeled acacias. Acacias are actually a member of a much larger group called the legume family, or the Fabaceae. Now, you might be familiar with legumes. Those are like bean plants, all right? Coffee is also a legume as well, all right? It produces a fruit called a bean pod, and acacias also have this same feature. There's also a lot of similar floral features as well among all the members of the Fabaceae. Acacias specifically are found on all continents except Antarctica, but they're most species rich in Australia. A large number of acacias live in deserts and other arid regions of the world, and so they have unique adaptations to live in these harsh environments. Some of those adaptations include the ability to fix nitrogen and protective thorns. Like other members of the bean family, many acacias are capable of performing this nitrogen fixation process, in which they have bacteria that are housed symbiotically in their roots. These bacteria contain chemical machines that take atmospheric nitrogen, N2, and convert it into a form that can be used by the plants, allowing them to survive environments that are nitrogen poor, giving them an advantage over other plants that don't have this capacity. Now, the nitrogen fixation is not what we're here to talk about today. I just think that's an interesting feature of legumes, a unifying characteristic that many members of that family share. What we're most interested in here today is the precocious number of thorns that some species of acacias have. Now, not all, though. Interestingly, there's a whole bunch of species that live in the outback of Australia in deserts there that either have very few thorns or lack thorns altogether. But in the deserts of Africa and the Middle East, the extreme thorniness of the acacias give rise to the names devil thickets or devil trees for these plants. However, acacias that don't produce thorns often compensate for the fact that they don't have thorns as a protective mechanism for their precious leaves by producing an enormous amount of toxic chemicals in their leaves. So if you see an acacia and it doesn't have thorns, chances are it's going to be an unpalatable product that you're going to eat. Thorns in desert acacias. So how exactly are these characteristics of acacias adaptations to their environment? Thorns in desert acacias quite clearly are an adaptation of the plant that prevents the tender leaves from being eaten by herbivores. Thorns are non-photosynthetic tissues, and therefore they must cost energy to produce. And they're not benefiting the plant with respect to photosynthesis, right? They're not green, so they're not gathering energy from the sun. And therefore, they're an energy cost, whereas the leaves are gathering energy for the plant and producing sugar. But it must be worth the expense of producing a thorn for the plant on the whole, because the leaves are so important for the survival of the plant. So there's a balancing act here. The plant could put all of its energy into making leaves, in which case it can produce a lot more energy and therefore produce a lot more fruits, which give them a chance to have more offspring. But if you put all your energy into making leaves and don't protect those leaves in some way, then lots of different organisms out there in the environment are going to have a heyday, all right, eating those particular leaves, right, and getting to the fruits eventually and eating those fruits. And so you might lose more photosynthetic surface area due to herbivory than you would gain by simply putting all your energy into making leaves. So make some thorns. That requires energy, but for each thorn you produce, you might be able to protect the leaves so that they survive longer and therefore generate more energy over time. Now you can see from the picture I have here that the thorns produced are often longer than the leaves themselves. This is a very effective way of warding off large mouths, right, that take bites of plants. It's especially important for desert plants that they just can't afford to lose the few leaves they produce. However, it seems for every protective adaptation of one organism, there's another organism that probably has found a way to thwart those defenses. In this case, a giraffe has a 20-inch long tongue, and that tongue is super tough. The bottom lip is so incredibly tough that it can withstand the poking of these thorns without much problem. They also can reach very high up into these acacia trees, well beyond the range of other plants, other animals. So even the inside of the giraffe's mouth is adapted to eating what would be inedible food for you and I. So giraffes can not only reach high into the acacia tree, but they also have the physical traits needed to take advantage of acacia as a food source. On the other hand, in Australia, there aren't many native large herbivores, other than a few marsupials, most of which can't reach into trees. Australian acacias still need protection, though. They don't need protection from these large herbivores, and therefore they don't need the large spines. Instead, what they do, they need protection from caterpillars and other insects that are really common there. And so they're more likely to do what? To produce large amounts of toxins in their leaves, making their leaves unpalatable to eat by those smaller insects. So the lack of thorns in the Australian outback makes sense, right? We don't have to evoke any kind of relationship to man, right, to sin or to our effects on the environment to show why some acacias have adapted to having thorns and some acacias in other environments have adapted to not having thorns and instead investing their energy into toxins instead. Some acacias in Central America produce swollen thorns, right, that are hollowed out by ants as homes. There are multiple species of acacias that have this ability, and each one has its own species of ant that lives in its thorns, right? So we're saying each species of acacia has a particular thorn type, which is been made a home for ants, and those ants that live in those particular thorns of that particular species are different species than another species living on a different acacia. This is something we call coevolution or co-adaptation. Some acacias don't only just provide a home for the ants that live on the trees. they also provide food for the ants, which live exclusively on these trees. That food can be found in one of two different forms. There's something called Beltian bodies, which are small protein lipid bodies that are rich in food sources for ants, and they produce those at the tips of some of the leaflets, or sometimes instead of having a leaflet, which is green and photosynthetic and therefore making sugar for the plant, they'll make this Beltian body, the yellow structure you see here, and that is made specifically for the ant. The ant can come along, clip that off, and then take it to this thorn, right, its home, and then it will consume it there. So the plant is feeding the ants. You might wonder, well, what are the ants getting out of this? All right. Oh, sorry. Of course the ants are getting something out of this. They're getting food and a protective home. What are the plants getting out of this? They're spending energy feeding the ant. They're making a thorn that's actually, it's a larger than normal thorn that's hollowed out, and so therefore they had to produce a large structure, which takes more energy to do. And so they're going a long way to making these ants happy. Well, what do the ants do? Well, the ants protect the plant. Any insects that would come to munch on the leaves, any caterpillars, right? Any other kinds of biting insects, or even any herbivore that would want to munch on these trees, these ants will aggressively attack, right? Driving them away, and therefore maintaining the leaves that are present. So it's a good trade-off. The plant has to use some of the energy from its photosynthesis in order to make these food sources for the ants. And so isn't able to make quite as much sugar as it could before, but on the other hand, all of its leaves are not being eaten, and therefore they can continuously make the sugar, so they have plenty of energy to give to the ants. It's a great trade-off. There's also some acacias, not all acacias, different acacias take different strategies, right? We have different forms. So even though we have very closely related species sometimes, they produce these different adaptations for survival. Some acacias produce what are called extrafloral nectaries. And you can kind of see one right here in the middle of this picture. There's kind of like a little bulge right there with that little green dot. This isn't the best example. A lot of plants at the base of the leaves will have some little red spots. And those red spots are where the sap basically is allowed to leak out. In other words, they have developed weak spots there in order for the sap to be available, not to aphids and other creatures which are going to take off with it and not do anything for the plant. They're doing it for the ants, right? The ants can come over there, drink a little bit of this sap, and that's another way they can get energy. So in some cases, they're making Beltian bodies and they're giving them some sap. So they're really treating their host, their community very well that's living on them. Sometimes just one, or sometimes the other, right? So these ants, they're really very well taken care of by the trees. And the trees in return, as we already mentioned, they get a favor as well. These ants are really ferocious defenders of the tree. For at least one species of acacia, the ants will even go as far as chopping down all the vegetation around the acacia tree to reduce competition, allowing the plant to have more access to sunlight. Less competition for water in its roots and so forth, right? And so these plants are going out and they are attacking. I'm sorry, the ants are going out and actually attacking the vegetation around. They recognize their host and don't attack their own host, but they attack everything else around them, allowing the tree to be an island, basically. What a great strategy for survival, but it depends on the two working together. A really close association. Oh, I forgot I had this picture. So here you see a hollowed out thorn with a hole there where where a group of ants can live. And there you see the red spots there, which are that's the extra floral nectaries that provide energy for the ants. That's a little bit about acacias. I'm trying to impress upon you the complexity of acacias, the variety of acacias, the complex ecological associations that they have with other organisms around them. So now let's ask, prelapsarian pre-adaptations to the fall? Ooh, that was a mouthful. Prelapsarian means before the fall. If you were to ask, what were these thorns? Because if you know what I'm talking about here, in my prior video, we talked about how many young Earth creationists believe that thorns and thistles, and I said this in the introduction as well, that thorns and thistles didn't exist in the original perfect creation. And therefore, all these things I've just shown you have to be things that originated or appeared after Adam's fall. Somehow sin introduced into the world these changes, causing these very complex designed features, right, to come about, giving us the type of ecology and interactions, the interactions we see today. So, given this short background on these adaptations of acacias, let's ask this question. Which of these adaptations is not a good feature for the plant? Creation scientists tell us that any evidence of features that would be used for competition or for adaptation to a world in which there's death and there's decay have to be features which could not be present, or at least they couldn't have served any apparent purpose. Right? The thorns wouldn't have the purpose of protecting the plant. The thorns may have been present, but you wouldn't call them thorns because apparently they couldn't hurt anything and they had no protective value in the original creation. So now, how, according to young earth creationists, do such intricate features that seem so well designed for this fallen, or what we call the Prelapsarian world, how did those features come about? The creation science explanation for this is probably best summed up in this paragraph from an article talking about the complex interactions between certain wasps that are able to attack and anesthetize tarantulas and then use them as hosts for their larvae. That's how they complete their life cycle. But of course, this kind of interaction seems to be an anathema to young earth creationist perception of what the original creation was like prior to Adam introducing sin or death and decay into the world. So now remember, this is a young earth creationist talking, trying to explain and think through how these bizarre relationships between organisms originated. Where did they come from? The mother wasp is genetically and behaviorally programmed to locate and anesthetize a tarantula and to carefully transfer her larva offspring to the arachnid's body. Why does all this work out the way it does in each life cycle of this particular kind of wasp? Because before Adam's fall in Eden, God cleverly and carefully planned out, consistent with his infinite foreknowledge, the innumerable details that would be needed after Eden, right? After Adam leaves Eden, to make this air-to-ground system operate successfully enough to propagate tarantula hawk wasps from one generation to the next. So what's this person's answer, right? What's James Johnson's answer to how this intricate relationship between wasps and tarantulas came about? Somehow God planned all this prior to Adam's sin. So foreknew that Adam would fall, and therefore he was going to have to curse the world and introduce death into the world. And so planned for all these types of death to occur. And these very intricate ways in which organisms utilize other organisms in their life histories. Their life history requires another life going extinct, right? Of being another life ending. But all of that is planned by God, right? He carefully planned out all these intimate details such that after Adam walked out of the garden, suddenly these animals would either change their behavior, but also potentially express brand new traits that were sort of like hidden genetic potential that had been stored inside of their cells, so that when they gave rise to the next generation, suddenly all these new intricate features popped out that allow them to live in a world in which there's competition and death, right? That is where many young earth creationists have to go. This is the well they have to go to in order to explain the amazing design of the current organisms that live in the present world. So to put it that another way, all right, to say that again in another way, the wasp in the garden, and presumably outside Eden, but you can see my other video for some discussion of that. would not have attacked or killed a tarantula, and it would somehow have found a way to make more wasps without having to use tarantulas. They had some other mechanism of propagating themselves in some non-destructive way, such that the parents also wouldn't die. However, for Johnson, this ability of wasps to find and use tarantulas as hosts for the young is so intricate that he believes it could not have been created this way. So he proposes that God pre-programmed the wasp so that natural selection put into motion by Adam's sin, he actually mentions that natural selection begins with Adam's sin. That's one of the things that's the result of the fall, is that natural selection is a product of Adam's sin and is a mechanism for adapting the world in this deadly age. So, but stick with me here. If Adam's sin would have put into a series of motions that God knew would happen and gave wasps this new way of propagating themselves, was the old way just not good enough? Why did Adam's sin require that wasps be reprogrammed but could not have been pre-programmed by recreation? Right? Johnson and other young earth creationists don't want to say that God remade organisms. He wants to say that all these features were embedded within the organisms. Why? Because no new information is created. Once God has created everything in the 6 days, the Garden of Eden and Adam's sin, that was after the 6-day creation was fulfilled, was completed, right? And God said it was all very good. And he doesn't create anything new anymore. Everything is simply an altered state of something from its original creation. And this is why young earth creationists are stuck. They can't employ God simply snapping his fingers and creating something new, because the creation is done. And so therefore they have to find inside these organisms the genetic mechanisms or some genes that are laying there latent, meaning they're not being used in the original creation, but they're sort of like waiting. Like, I'm here so that I'm waiting when Adam sinned. Oh, that will turn on through some epigenetic mechanism or something like that. That'll turn this gene on, and suddenly I'll start behaving differently in this new world because I'm adapted for this world of sin and death now. These are really difficult questions that, although young earth creationists sound kind of confident when they tell their audience, like, oh, well, this happened, or it's just that there was pre-programming that occurred. I find that many young earth creationists really do get very nervous talking about these things. They use very hand-wavy language of, well, that possibly this is what happened. But none of it is, none of it under the hood makes any sense. Okay, let's return to the Acacias. Creation scientists insist that thorns are bad. They could have no part of this good creation. Rather, they're the result of Adam's sin. But how do they define good? All right, that word good. It appears good is not defined scripturally, but by their feelings about what makes something good in their minds. In Genesis 1, good is a reference to the purpose of things, not to the actual physical object itself. And I talked a little bit about that in my previous video. What God has made is good. Why? Because it's good for man, good for for man's ecology in this world, right? It's good for what the world was made for, as a home for man and a place to interact and live out a life glorifying God. It might be helpful to look at what was not good in the creation account. I really think you should think about what was not a good thing. It wasn't good that Adam should be alone. That wasn't a good thing. Even though Adam was created in the creation, the 6-day creation, in talking about the traditional 6-day creation view. Even though Adam was created in that 6-day creation, it still stated that it wasn't good. So not everything was good. He was lacking a partner. It was not good that the world should be in a state of chaos and disorder. And so God ordered it for man, right? He spent time ordering the things of the world, placing them in their positions or giving them purpose. He didn't declare the results of his creative acts on day 2 good, right? You have each of those day 1, and at the end it says, and it was good, right? On day 2, doesn't say it was good, possibly because the results of those actions, which are the separation of the waters, all right, from the waters above and the waters below, didn't really yield anything good for man, since the land which he would eventually live on wasn't formed until day 3. right? There's nothing there from the perspective of man as God's created vice regent on earth that was going to benefit from the things on day 2. So day 2 is not proclaimed to have resulted in being a good day. Now, what about thorn bushes and thistles? Are they good? I wouldn't label them as good. They're part of the disordered creation that Adam, as God's image bearer on earth, was supposed to have tamed. I talked about this some in my first video. God formed man from the dust of the ground, placed him in his presence, in God's presence in the garden, right? A temple-like feature or place on earth where he would commune with God, his creator. There he was given instructions, right? Adam was given instructions, including what? The command to guard and protect the garden from the evil one. If he obeyed the scriptures, the scriptures paint this picture of an expanding garden, right? That's where, see this idea of the garden temple, a framework for a biblical worldview of the expanding garden. Adam would have brought the rest of creation under his submission as a steward of God's creation. That creation included what? Thorns and thistles that were part of the original world that man was created in prior to being brought into the garden. They're a natural part of the world. They're part of God's good creation. Remember that God, as part of his curse, said the ground would bring forth thorns and thistles. This is the same place that Adam originally came from, the ground. Adam was expelled from the garden into the as yet untamed world, the place outside of Eden. That world was not like the garden, where the fruits and the plants were easily obtained. It was a tended garden, right? It included fruit trees and presumably other cultivated plants. And those cultivated plants didn't have thorns and thistles on them. They were readily available to eat, just as God said, gave all those things to be eaten. Instead of easy fruit to pick, he's going to have to, now in this untamed world, he's going to have to plant crops and he's going to have to tame that land, right? But it's going to be difficult to do because there are these thorn bushes, right? In the wilderness, the untamed world. An imperfect relationship to God now, because that's essentially what the fall is a disruption of the relationship of God and man. And that imperfect relationship between God and between fellow men, all right, all individuals, would mean that instead of bringing the ground into submission by working together in harmony to tend the field and protect it from the encroaching weeds, man would disagree with one another, right? Man would be envious and steal from one another. Man wouldn't work very hard. So his crops would also be sown along with the thorn bushes and thistles, which are spoken of frequently throughout the scriptures. And his relationships being impeded are symbolically also the thorn bushes and thistles of his life. But there's actually like the physical disruption of the process of tending and producing fruit. So I hope my brief comments here have sort of fleshed out a bit more from my other article, the Adam and Eve and the corruption of nature. Which is kind of a way of trying to look at an interpretation of the whole of scriptures with respect to the conditions and purpose of God's original creation. There's just like so many other questions that this really short video raises that we might be able to explore in the future. For example, if giraffes did not need long necks to reach food, and they did not need to have resistant mouths and for spines, did they not need to have long necks or very long tongues and an exceedingly tough skin in their mouths in the Prelapsarian world? Why do they have all these specialized features? It's easy to explain today in this Lapsarian world. But for young earth creationists, they're challenged to answer these types of questions. If some ant species only live on acacias, where did they live when acacias had no spines? Right? If spines didn't come into existence until Adam sinned, but there are ant species that are specialized to live in the spines of a particular species of acacia, how do they come to that particular relationship? If acacias have hundreds of genes that code for highly specialized features that allow them to survive in extreme environments, like extreme deserts, what purpose did these genes and features serve in the idyllic good creation as envisioned by many young earth literalists? In fact, most young earth creationists don't believe that harsh environments really existed prior to the flood, much less before Adam's sin. Instead, they view the entire world, the entire globe in the original creation as being this perfect paradise. Almost like a tropical paradise where every single fruit, every single plant is food for all the other animals, including human beings. There's no death of any animals. There's no complex ecology that could exist because there's no competition for anything. It's a world that's really impossible to imagine or to draw up or to try to explain how it would functionally work. But young earth creationists are challenged to do that because that is the world that they envision. And thus far, they really haven't come up with the explanations for how you go from that world, what that world would have worked, how it would have functioned, and how it changed as the result of sin. A few things to ponder for today. That's all I've got. Thanks for listening. Subscribe, like, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.